Hi, my name is Lorraine Watry and welcome to my studio. I am a watercolor artist and I've worked with watercolor for 26 years now, and I thought I would start a new series of videos where I go over different tips, tricks, and techniques for working with watercolor. And hopefully these short videos will help you in your journey, and if you have a question or a technique that you would like to see, please comment below and I will try to accommodate that in a future video. Today's tip and trick video is going to be a continuation of last week's video where I was showing how I masked a bird in the snow, and it will also be an expansion of how to do snow techniques. So the first thing that I am going to do is just basically set up how I'm going to do this. So this was a techniques page that I did with a class on painting snow, and so I will walk through some of these different techniques. We will not get them all done today because some of the mask will need to dry, but I wanted to show you the different aspects of how you can do things with snow. And so I have drawn out those rectangles and given myself basically the same layout to show you some of those. And one of the first things that I am going to do is place some masking fluid using a toothbrush onto this top square up here. And I think you can see in the video how this area looks like it could be a sky with snow falling and that it's kind of stormy. So in order to get the little droplets of mask on there and have it look random and natural, not too even if you were placing it on carefully with your by hand, I use a toothbrush. So I am going to get this square set up, and I will need paper towels to go around my area here. You could use pieces of paper or other things, but I want to make sure that I am not splattering masking fluid, sorry about the noise, all over either other parts of my paper or my table. And when you're doing the toothbrush method, it can kind of go places you don't necessarily want it. So let me move these for a second. And while I am getting this ready, I wanted to mention that generally I use the Winsor and Newton colorless art masking fluid, and I really like the non-colored mask because I don't want it to affect what I am seeing in my painting. But when you are doing snow, and if you're doing something where you have little droplets of snow falling out of the sky, then it can be hard to tell where it is landing on your page and how much you've covered or not. So what I would suggest is you can use something like a colored mask like the PBO drawing gum instead, and that is a good option. But you can also use and I will use that for this painting just so you can see how dark it goes on. But you can also take the masking fluid and put just a couple drops of one of your watercolors into the mask, and and I would put it in a separate container to do that. So I'll show you on my bird painting in just a second how I do that. So I am going to take the mask, and in order to use a toothbrush, you can use probably any toothbrush, but I have some of these old toothbrushes that have the flat heads, and if it was ever used for a toothbrush, I would just make sure that it's as clean as you can get it before you use it with the mask, just to make sure there's no reactions with anything that might be on the brush. This one actually has a little bit of old mask in it, or maybe it's paint. It may be a combination of the two, because you can also use toothbrushes, dip it in paint, and then you can flick it on your paper and create texture that way. So I am going to try the smaller one of my two brushes, and I just dip the front little corner there, and then I twist and rotate the brush, and you will get a combination of small and large flecks of mask falling onto your paper. So if you get a large droplet happening, then you might want to let it dry and then try to remove it. If you try to remove it while it is still wet, generally you just cause an issue and spread it onto the paper. So you can see where it can give you randomness. It does fall differently for different toothbrushes. And then one of the things to remember is that you need to clean your brush as quickly as you can so that the mask doesn't get caught in there. So I have some water off to the side here, and I'm going to clean the brush right quick. So I will pause and I'll come right back. I used the warm water to get the brush pretty clean. It looks pretty good, and over time, if you use it a lot, it can get a buildup in there, but that's pretty good. So then I'm going to move these pieces, and I will add, and you can see actually where it went under my paper towel there, so the towel was just lifted up just a touch. So depending on what you have around your area where you're spritzing mask, I would just make sure that it's down, and you're not going to end up getting mask somewhere that you don't want it. And so I'll move those guys for a minute, and I can go back in once this is dry, and I could just lift that if that was in an area that I didn't want it. So I will move my demo page. And on the bird itself, I am going to spritz mask around on here because I want it to have the feeling that it is snowing. And I used in the previous video, I showed how to use masking tape to mask the foreground parts of this painting. And so if you haven't seen that video, you might want to watch it. You could use masking fluid to mask different parts of the painting. And I just chose to use the mask over this whole area, even though it's really the edges that I needed to protect. And my bird is my center of focus. There's a little bird sitting on a branch with some evergreen needles around it. And generally, that's the area I want to protect. But because I'm going to do the background first, I just figured it was easy enough just to mask the whole thing. So I am going to use my regular mask now, and I'll go ahead and place a piece of towel here so I don't get it on the bird. And I have a small glass lid from an old antique jar. If I can get this to open. Some of these bottles, sometimes the mask gets caught in the lid area. And I won't need a lot, but I'm going to pour out some and set that over there for a second. And then I am going to use some of my cobalt paint. And I want to, I'll probably go ahead and tear these down just a little bit. I'm going to protect the surface of my board and the table around my paintings so that I don't end up with mask all over my table. And I'll speed this part up, and I'll be right back with you. So like I said, I am going to use some cobalt to put a little color into the masking fluid. And depending on the mask, some masks are thicker, some are thinner, and some handle adding a little bit of liquid to them, either water or a little bit of paint, without an issue. And I would test your mask to see if that's something that it can use, is a little bit of water added to it or a little bit of paint. And I would not use a staining color. So cobalt is non-staining, and I don't need a lot of it. Whoops, attached. There we go. And I usually try to just drip it in. If it's not going to go in easily, sometimes I'll squeeze the tip of the brush and get some of the color off. And then you can use the back of a brush. You can use your toothbrush if you're going to be using that to use with the mask. And you can also use colored mask for other things. If you want to just add a touch of color to give it a little bit more value so that you can see where you're placing it, it can be used. It doesn't have to be just a toothbrush that you're doing this with. And I'm going to just pull that around. And then I am going to use my bigger brush this time. I don't know if it'll make a huge difference, but I've got some on the tip. And hopefully you can see some of that going on. And like I said before, I like to rotate my hand. And depending on how hard you're flicking, how much you're pulling at it, or how little, that will make a difference, or can make a difference on how big drops or how much gets spattered in an area at once. So it's kind of just playing with your tool, your toothbrush, and trying things. Now, once I have painted the background, I will also come back, remove the mask on the bird, and I will flick some more of this on the area where the masking tape is going to be removed. So and so those bigger drops luckily fell on the masking tape, so I won't have them on the background that I have to clean up, but I will lift those back off of there. So now that I've got that area masked, then I can let that dry completely, and then once that mask is dry, then I could start the background. So for this painting, I will show the start of the background in the next video, and so I'll put it away for now. And I need to clean my toothbrush again, so I will pause and I will be right back. So I finished up, moved the bird out of the way, and I am going to start doing some of these techniques. And I hope my mask is still wet enough that I can go ahead and use it for placing mask on this top one. And you can do this mask by hand, but sometimes using a sea sponge is a quicker way, and it's a little bit more of a realistic looking random mask on those would be distant trees. The one thing I would look out for is that this kind of sponge where it's really tight and there's lots of small little openings, I don't often get the kind of look that I want using this kind. I try to find sea sponges that are bigger openings and kind of random look to them. So I thought today I would try this one. And my mask is starting to get a film on it, but I will try this. And I was going to mention that if you're using a toothbrush or a sponge like this to apply mask, I would clean it in a separate container of water. I would not clean it in the water that you normally use for your brushes. And when you apply the mask with a sponge, you're going to get a random feel to it, and I actually am having little openings because of the, it was drying. Because of the sponge, it's not going to be as closed a feel to it. So like I said, these would be distant trees. And I'm actually going to pour a little bit of my PBO in here because I ran out. And I'll see if I can add a little bit more to this area. Generally with masking fluid, I try to work, and that's actually kind of getting messed up on the sponge. I'm going to go ahead and put that in my water and get a different sponge. I try to work with my mask in a separate container, not the one that it comes in, because I want to keep my mask closed as much as possible. So again, this would need to dry. So this is something that I can add some paint to probably in the next video, the continuation of this week's. So I'm going to go ahead and pause for a second and clean these sponges as best I can. It doesn't always come out of the sponge because it wants to adhere to the fibers of the sponge, but I will pause and I'll be right back. So now that I have the mask on this first rectangle dry, I am going to go ahead and paint a sky in on this one, and then I'll do a little bit on this one today, and then I will save some of the other ones for the next video. And I am going to pull out some ultramarine blue. Get my bigger brush. And I am looking for kind of a gray-blue mix that I can use to make the sky look stormy. And I will be painting this on wet and leaving a little bit of white peeking through so that it looks like there's snow falling. And you could just do it gray if you'd like, because you can see snowy skies where it is a darker color as well. All right, and I'll get out, that first color was ultramarine blue, and then I'm going to pull out some burnt sienna to gray it, and I'll need more ultramarine blue than I will of the burnt sienna. Depending on how gray you want it, you can push it to be more gray by adding more of the burnt sienna to it. And now I'm going to use some clear water, as long as my brush is clean, and just paint the clear water on this rectangle. All right, I've got the water everywhere. My paper is decently moist. It's not pooling lots of water at the bottom. So one of the things that to be aware of when you're doing wet on wet is how wet the paper is. I'm going to dry the back of my brush just a little bit so that as I place the first color, if it was moving a lot, I would just wait, because I want it to move, but I don't necessarily want it to really run a lot. And I am going back into the burnt sienna to have some areas that feel a little grayer. And then basically I'm just kind of placing the color on. I like some of those diagonal type of lines in there, because that gives it the feeling that maybe the snow that's falling is swirling in the air. And so try to get some of this color where a lot of my mask is so that it will read as snow falling once I remove the mask. So that will have to dry before I can take the mask off, and I will go on to this little area down here where I did a tree. And I'm only going to start the background on this one because I need to let the background dry before I would move on. And I actually will do one more today. I'll do this one down here. So the sky on this one, I'm going to imagine that it's a bright Colorado blue day. And so I'm just going to use some cobalt and maybe a touch of cerulean with it. Just so that it'll have a little variety. And you could also do this with some clouds back there. Maybe I'll do that just for fun today. And so I have cerulean and I have cobalt out, and then I am going to wet around. I did not mask. This little tree has heavily laden branches with big clumps of snow on it. And so I did not mask them, but you could, and I would just use masking fluid around, and I have a touch of blue left in my brush, but that's all right. And I am coming close to the snow, but I'm not coming right up to the lines completely yet, because it's easier to see where you are, where you're placing your water if you have color in the water or you have paint on your brush. So normally I wouldn't necessarily be using water that has color in it, so but that's okay for this. All right, so I'm going to go grab some of the cobalt and a little bit of the cerulean, and then as I come around those clumps of snow on the tree, I am coming right up to their edges. And so if you took the time to mask, this would be simpler because you wouldn't have to be as careful as you're applying the paint. And I am not worried about where any of the pine needles might be coming. out of the tree branches because those are going to be darker anyway. And so just placing the color on and letting some of it move and run because the water on the paper is still pretty wet, which is fine for this. And it does give it a little bit of a atmospheric feel to not have it be a solid blue background. And you could also add some grays if you wanted to. So if I add a little bit of gray that I already had mixed in there, that will also change how it feels. Could be a little bit of more of a stormy day rather than purely sunny. And I'm just going to come down, and there's a branch there, okay, and get around those clumps and pull it down to the bottom. And then the last rectangle, so this is just the start of this, and this will have to dry, as I said, and then I can add to that next week. Just a little bit more color in here. And today I'm using a tablet of Fabriano cold press watercolor paper, so it might have a little bit of a different texture or feel than Arches or some of the other brands of paper. And I was going to do this one, but I think I'll do this one. This is the square that I use to show students that they could use salt to give the feeling of snow. And I actually don't really use salt in my paintings, but I do know that some people like that texture, and it can give you an interesting snow scene. So I painted the water on. You could just paint the color across there, and I would try different salts. So this one is a heavier, coarser salt. It's one that I had from some pretzels, and you can use table salt. And let me get some color. I think I will use the cobalt with the burnt sienna on this one, and I'm just going to do the same thing where I place the color on and let there be some openings, like there might be some white clouds or heavier areas of snow, and then I will just lay the salt on there. And depending on how quickly you place the salt on your paper, if it's too dry, it won't do anything. If it's too wet, it could just basically suck up the salt will pull the moisture in, and then you don't get the little marks of the salt once it's dry. So then I will have to leave this. I'll let it dry, and then in next week's video I can show you if that worked. I may have actually placed the salt on there a little too early, but I will see, and I will show you how these areas look in next week's video. Have a tip, trick, or technique that you would like to see in watercolor, please like and subscribe to my videos. And if you leave a comment with a technique or tip that you would like to see, I will try to fit that into the list, and I will see you next week. Thanks. Bye.